الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا.
All right, let's start. 20 years ago, when I taught for 2 years at the American University of Cairo, I was introduced to an extremely useful Arabic expression, kalam fadi. It means empty words, but it's used in the same way that we use the phrase bullshit. It's just a little more polite. They use it to describe statements that are flowery, elaborate, and that are devoid of content, or worse, are flatly at variance with obvious reality. There is a great deal of this in the political culture in the region, and as we already know, this region's political culture is not the only political culture where this is a problem. Why, just yesterday, or maybe the day before, there was an excellent example of kalam fadi as delivered from the mouth of the United States Secretary of State, which said that, gosh, we really don't like what's happening in Iran because it's becoming a military dictatorship. One could ask, well, what was it before? And if it was, therefore, some sort of democracy before, how come we've had no embassy there for 30 years? Anyway, what happened when she said this, it was in a speech in Dubai, in the Arab Gulf, in a fancy hotel, in a big ballroom, was that the audience, largely composed of Arabs from the Gulf, Gulfies as they're called, there was quite a bit of tittering and chuckles, some outright muffled guffaws, as one journalist put it, because, after all, half a century of American foreign policy flatly contradicts this sentiment. We've adored military dictatorships, and we've long supported states that are fundamentally rooted and based not in the will of the people, but in the will of the internal security apparatus and the intelligence services. As Rami Buri puts it, our closest allies are military and police states. Guns rule. Citizens get to do certain other things if they have the money. In the Gulf, they have the money. Elsewhere, they may not. And these countries are devoted to maintaining order, and we like them just fine as a result of this. So this kind of kalam fadi is all over the place, and shows us that we do need to talk about governance. And to talk about governance, oil is a big deal. Oil is a big deal because it accrues directly to the state. And if the revenue accrues directly to the state, and if this state is relatively unaccountable, which it is likely to be for various historical reasons, this then gives the state huge powers to basically do what it wants. It's as if, as you remember that diagram from Charles Tilly, when you sever the need for revenue from the need to make alliances with locals who have the money that you want to get, so you've got to tax them. You get to a situation where it's no longer the case that there are really any pressures for any kind of democratic governance. It also leads to widespread corruption, whatever exactly that might mean, because after all, if money accrues directly to the coffers of the state, and there aren't very many pressures on the state about how it behaves, then the state gets to decide how it uses this money, and who's to say that it's not so good. There is an organization headquartered in Berlin called Transparency International. They have a website. This map is a little bit out of date. They attempt to rank states around the world in terms of corruption, and you will note that the Middle East and North Africa does not do very well. Incidentally, this state right there, Afghanistan, has since fallen in their rankings, as we'll see next week. Afghanistan now is the second from the bottom in terms of ranking on corruption, with the top being New Zealand, the least corrupt state, they say, in the world. Now, we know that these states faced serious challenges in the period of low oil prices. The youth bulge was growing, additions to the labor force were accelerating, and growth was slow because oil prices drive, through the revenue effect, drive so much of what happens in the region. So all of these economic challenges were proliferating, and there was this idea, very current in Washington, that this would lead to democracy. It was sort of the flip side of the argument I've just enunciated, which is, well, if these states have a lot of money, that they don't have to tax anybody, they just get it directly, so there's no representation without taxation. But now that those rents have declined so much, therefore they're going to have to do the opposite. They're going to have to behave more like other non-oil states and try to forge alliances with local power groups and start taxing them, and so this will create a kind of momentum for democracy. This was the idea. Okay? This idea, however, did not work out exactly the way folks in Washington imagined. There is the Mukhabarat, another Arabic word. It means internal security agencies or the intelligence service. Think the police. Okay? And these states, which are rooted, as I've been mentioning, in the Mukhabarat, in the internal security services, proved much more durable than people in Washington like to think. The capacity of states to survive was widely underrated. Why? How did they survive? They had strategies, and these strategies were classic and extremely simple. So in the first place, even though oil rents may have declined, they were still substantial. There was still a lot of money, and there was still money in the hands of the state. So what the state could do was, yes, perhaps it would have difficulty channeling as many resources to all of the citizens. But every state typically has a core basis of support, some set of social actors that are perfectly happy to go along with this repressive state. They make money out of this repressive state. They are contractors to this repressive state. And you channel your money to those folks, ensuring that your core source of support remains more or less intact. What do you do with everybody else? That's pretty simple. You break their bones if necessary. You simply repress them. So it's a classic carrot and stick kind of policy that was followed then and is followed now. Here's a little graph from a little taxonomy. Basically says the same thing. Say, well, you want to maintain this monopoly on force, so what do? You suppress voice, you suppress accountability. People who challenge your decisions, you make sure that they go away, and you make sure they go away either because you buy them off, co-optation, or you repress them. Either one will do, and typically, indeed invariably, states use a mixture. All of these states use mixtures of patronage and bribery and co-optation on the one hand with repression on the other. Meanwhile, back in Washington, we thought, boy, this is going to lead to democracy. Now, we looked at this a little bit when we looked at sort of some of the American sources of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq. Okay, the kind of notion of liberal imperialism, we needed to go do this in order to spread human rights and so forth. And this was very much part of that atmosphere in the 1990s. We thought they'd have to liberalize their economies because of the failure of oil rents. Remember, we saw last time how very state-centric these economies were. And the notion was, all of this stuff is pushing for the best of all possible outcomes. We're going to get democratic capitalism, as we Americans think of it, spreading throughout the Middle East. Part of the reason we thought that, which, as we'll see, was really quite fanciful and deluded, but in addition to that delusion, we also were misinterpreting another part of the world. People at the time, they do this much less today, The people at the time were saying, well, look, if you look at what happened in East Asia, why they've grown really rapidly, and now they have some democratic elections in Korea and Taiwan, and inevitably this will happen over time, and this is just the way it goes. Well, it's true that East Asia grew extremely dramatically, but it was not because of the lack of a state. In fact, quite the contrary. It was because the state was very strong and very effective. The first thing they did was to redistribute land. Every one of them had a major land reform of one sort or another, with more or less violence. Very few of Middle Eastern states have done anything like this. They then, in Asia, poured resources into education, particularly concentrating on mass literacy, then going on to secondary education. They fostered systematic cooperation between government and business. This was, to put it mildly, not exactly an Adam Smith-style strategy. They developed then targeted export strategies. These were developed by government and business working together, figuring out which markets, at first almost entirely in the United States, and then later, more broadly in the rest of the world, would be the best kind of exports to go. In the case of the People's Republic of China, there was an additional variable, which was the existence of a gigantic amount of money, possible investment funds in the hands of the very diverse and very large and, in many cases, very wealthy overseas Chinese community. And the Chinese government systematically tried to attract the investment of such people into the People's Republic, and they were hugely successful in doing this. We thought, on the other hand, that it was all done by the market. Once again, one of the things I can't stress enough in terms of basic understanding of the world is everybody's got an ideology, and ideology blinds people to what is actually going on. And this is as certainly as true of Americans as it is for anyone else in the world. We see what we want to see. We see our own unexamined presuppositions and assumptions about the way the world works. An example of this is given in a famous volume that the World Bank produced. It's called The East Asian Miracle. There's the picture from Amazon. And there was a huge struggle over this. It was originally sponsored by the government of Japan. These books are expensive. You have to hire all kinds of specialists and economists to conduct a huge range of studies in order to come up with a synthesized volume of this sort. The Japanese government was not comfortable with American-dominated World Bank recommendations, which seemed to ignore the experience of Japan and other countries in East Asia. There were lots of twists and turns and internal debates because the bank, of course, had its own views and was very much a kind of laissez-faire, Adam Smith kind of notion. And it reminds one of the Greek myth of the Procrustean bed, where this guy said, sure, anybody can sleep in my bed. You just need to fit in the bed. And if you're too long, sure, no problem. I just chop off your feet. And if you're too short, no problem. I just stretch you out using the rack. Right? So it's sort of it is a kind of a myth, an image that describes making stuff fit no matter what. You just torture the data until it confirms your theory, and that was what happened in the case of this volume. At the time, in the 1990s, there was a thing called the Washington Consensus. You can read this slide online. It's a long list of essentially policy recommendations that were developed by American economists, largely, not exclusively, but largely. It was the orthodoxy of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and we thought this should be promoted all over the place. And it was essentially a model of liberalizing the economy, meaning reducing the role of the state and increasing reliance on price mechanisms. Difficulty with doing this is, as you can see down at the bottom, deregulation, securing property rights. Property rights systems, of course, are secured through legal systems, which are in turn are connected to the state, which then has to do with what is the nature of the state. And so, as these recommendations didn't work out quite as well as people had assumed, they then had to be augmented. And notice what happens. As they augmented this, these recommendations become more and more intrusive in the sense of the kinds of governance or the level of governance that you're talking about as outsiders. They became, at least they were increasingly viewed in many parts of the world as a form of neo-colonialism. They were a way in which Westerners were getting further and further into the kitchen, if you like, in terms of trying to figure this out. Now, throughout all this, there was, of course, an elephant in the room. And we've already mentioned this elephant. First, past history. Everywhere in the world, every rich country went through a period of import substituting industrialization. The only possible exception is Britain, and even that is disputed by economic historians. Asia in general does not fit the model. China in particular obviously does not fit the model. And China, this is the country with the fastest growth record in history, the largest reduction of poverty in the history of the human species. This is, after all, supposedly the purpose of economic development. And in China, Western advice was, to put it mildly, systematically ignored, indeed often contemptuously ignored. So it didn't fit. But never mind. We plunged ahead. We said, well, democracy. We got to have democracy in the region, right? And this is this idea, again, from that previous lecture about why how we got into Iraq from the American side, of the way this neoliberalism, that kind of notion of they need to liberalize their economies, we need to promote democracy, we need to get this, and we get further and further into the business of governance, and it keeps not happening. And in a way, this kind of opened the door to the neoconservatives who said, yeah, well, we know how to get them to get this governance to change. Go in and invade the place. Take over the government, and then that'll work. Yeah, that was the idea. Well placed to be concerned with governance in the region, but it's clearly open to abuses. There's a lot of rhetoric about human rights. But there was a big problem. The problem was not only structural in terms of what can outsiders really do, but every time, as we will see today, that there are movements, there are a series of times in which there has been movement in the direction of democracy, in the simple formal sense of having elections that are contested. But then, after all, if you're going to be a functioning democracy, part of the definition has to be that whoever wins the election, if the election is relatively fair, well, then they win the election, and they get to govern, right? I mean, this is sort of basic. But what would happen is that in a number of cases, people that the United States, or the government of the country in question, or the government of France, or the government of Israel, that outsiders would not like the outcome. And then they would overthrow it. They would say, no, this can't be true. Well, this, needless to say, is well known to folks in the region, but this is a kind of problem. It's very difficult for the United States to deal with Democrats who might be people with an ideology very much at variance with our own. Okay? And we were the sole superpower. We thought we could do anything. Here it's useful to take a leaf from John Gray, one of the people that I've assigned, to talk about two kinds of democracy. There's a liberal democracy, which is what we automatically think of when we think of democracy. And then there's something called illiberal democracy. Remember, one way to think about democracy, go back to the etymology of the word. It means rule by the people. It doesn't say anything about how those people rule. And it doesn't say anything at all about how the majority treats minorities. It says nothing about that. That's where the liberal comes in. Liberal democracy supposedly is a form of democracy, form of majority rule, but in which, depending on who you believe, you try to give all kinds of leeway to those who lose, to those who don't agree. You give them lots of space, you give them lots of civil rights, etc., etc. This, however, is hardly the only concept of democracy that's out there. There is this concept, and it's at least 200 years old, of illiberal democracy. Its origins can be traced to the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the philosophes writing in the era of the French Revolution. It was certainly part of the way that Jacobin revolutionaries in France ruled. If you didn't agree with them, they tended to chop off your head. And there are some possibilities that there are notions in Iran, for example, of Islamic republicanism. And really there are always these big questions. What are the limits of individual freedom? Or to look at the other side of that, what are the legitimate demands on the community that take precedence over any individual's right? Now, we've been arguing about this in the United States for 200 years, and we will unquestionably continue to argue about it forever, right? We argue about gay rights. We argue about gay marriage. We argued a generation ago about civil rights. We argued about segregation. We will continue to argue about this, no doubt, forever. Right? And it's always the case of balancing things. When does your free demand and the other person's right begin? I mean, do I have the freedom to drive any car I want? Well, yeah, maybe that contributes to global warming. So these debates are built into the nature of some kind of political system. So they're not going to go away, and they're answered differently in lots of different countries. Germans today give a very different answer to these questions of the legitimate demands of community. Take a trivial example. On Sunday, throughout Germany, you cannot run machines, you can't go out and mow your lawn, you can't trim hedges, you can't do any of this stuff because it's considered that noise disrupts the peace and quiet of your neighbors. In America, we would rise up and revolt if anyone told us this, right? And different countries come up with different ways of doing this. And the further away you get culturally from the United States, the more these issues become different. And in the Middle East and North Africa, in Islamic countries, there's quite a different sense of what the legitimate demands of the community are in comparison with the legitimate demands of the individual. Now, if you wanted to say, well, okay, we've got this problem. Let's back up a little bit. Let's not worry about that. Let's just talk about getting some kind of democratic system as opposed to this police state we've got. Now, there was a lot of experience with this because there were these transitions from dictatorship to some kind of democracy in Southern Europe, in Spain, in Greece, in the post-war era. There were similar transitions in various Latin American countries, and so then there was a transition in Eastern Europe. So there was a lot of thinking about this, and the basic idea was you had to have a political agreement. You had to have a pact in order to get this to happen. Simple model. Okay? You've got the state against the opposition. You've got inside the state two kinds of folks. Like any other model, this grossly oversimplifies reality, and the purpose is to try to illuminate things. You've got pragmatists, and then you've got the just shoot 'em guys, and they're mostly guys, the hardliners. On the side of the opposition, you've likewise got a split. You've got moderates. People who say, well, yeah, we don't like them, but we'd like to do a deal. We'd like to have some kind. We know we have to compromise. And then you have the folks, the exponents of purity, right? Radicals who say, no, any compromise is no good. Any compromise is terrible, and they're bad, and we should just fight them. And since they repress us, we should use force, and this is the only way. Now, the only way you ever get these transitions, at least in the literature that studies Southern Europe and the literature that studies South America, is that you get these folks in bold, pragmatists and moderates, do a deal. They make an agreement. They come to some kind of agreement. And this is an agreement that allows the pragmatists to say to the hardliners, look, don't be so nervous. This is working out. Your fundamental interests will not be threatened. You and your families will not be hauled before a court. You are not going to be hanged for your past crimes. So don't pick up the gun and start shooting people. And the moderates either persuade some radicals, look, so we've gotten something, it's better than nothing, or they're marginalized. In some cases, hardliners strike out against the state, and they have to be blocked. This happened in Spain during the transition. And in some cases, the radicals also get marginalized. Now, if you think about this model in the region, it would be a good thing, right? It would be nice to have fewer police states. But for that to happen, you've got to have the moderates in opposition join with the pragmatists. And it turns out that this kind of bargain has been opposed by the U.S. repeatedly. One of the things that Rami Khouri is talking about. And the reason, as we will see, is quite simple. Because the moderates in opposition, indeed the opposition in general, is dominated, it's not the only opposition, but the most powerful, meaning the political opposition that has the most popular support, that has the most diverse base, that is the best organized, are typically exponents of a political ideology that has come to be called Islamism. So we need to talk next about Islamism as the last piece, the ideological piece, in terms of understanding the internal dynamics inside the Middle East. This shows, they have a slogan all over the region. It's a slogan first developed in Egypt. Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the solution. And that's what it says in Arabic and in lots of different places, saying it over and over again. How to think about this? Now here again, as usual, for us Americans, when we want to understand this region, the first thing we have to do is take a metaphorical hatchet to the ideas we've inherited from our own culture. Right? We have to deconstruct our own minds. Right? Because there's a great deal of discussion of this phenomenon that is not only unhelpful, but decidedly misleading. The first thing, of course, is to reject any essentialist ideas. Everything is produced. Everything has causes. Causes and consequences lead to phenomena. Thinking of things as essential, as fixed, as frozen in time is always a mistake, and it typically leads to great difficulties. Samuel Huntington is a great exponent today of this kind of view, a clash of civilizations. There are all kinds of difficulties with his thesis, many. It neglects history. It ignores the constructed and constantly changing nature of reality. And it's really an inheritor of an earlier, much more explicit form of this view that's called Orientalism. One thing to think of, remember about Islamism, you will see in the American press a discussion of these people as being quote-unquote backward, of these people as being quote-unquote throwbacks, of these people as being quote-unquote unmodern. This is completely at variance with reality. We may not I don't like, a lot of things about their political ideology, but this does not mean that there is anything unmodern about this ideology. First, Orientalism. What did this say? This was an essentialist view pioneered by French colonial scholars in North Africa and then generalized and was really one form or another was very popular throughout the West. At first, it posits these essential poles. It's essentialist, nothing changes, they're just fixed. And we in the West are rational, developed, humane, and superior, but the Orient is aberrant, underdeveloped, cruel, and inferior. Right. They live by set rules, which are derived from sacred texts. And they're unchanging while we're dynamic, and they're to be feared and controlled. All of this is nonsense. If you want to hear more about this, take classes from Terry Burke in the history department. He's done a lot of his career, a lot of work on this, basically ripping these ideas to shred with a very, very fine-toothed saw. So you might want to talk to him. Now, how to think about this phenomenon of what I'm calling Islamism. Now, people sometimes talk about fundamentalism. Now, this is suggestive, but it's not a very helpful word to use in talking about anything in Islam for a number of reasons. First of all, the origin of the term comes from early 20th century Christianity, when Christians were caught up in this debate about Darwin. This is not really helpful in terms of thinking about Islam. First of all, because the Bible and fundamentalist Christians said, well, the Bible is something that we know is literally true. And that assumes that the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, has some kind of equivalence with the Bible. This isn't actually true, as the late great scholar at Harvard that taught me some stuff about Islam, William Campbell Smith said, that if you want to make a Christian analogy, I mean, the Eucharist is the idea that the body and blood of Jesus Christ is literally, physically embodied in the wafer, in the Mass. Okay? For a Muslim, the Quran it's called, what it means in Arabic is the reading. It's a recitation. It's thought that the Prophet Muhammad, who was illiterate, did not compose the Quran. Instead, God handed it to him instead of read it. So this is different. It's so thought of, it has a different kind of sacred status. So using fundamentalism, this term from Christianity, isn't very helpful. And then on the other side, there's a long tradition in Islam of what's called ijtihad or interpretation. This is particularly notable among Shia Muslims, who tend to be, often these days, somewhat at variance with American policy. So there's this term Islamism. Now we could call it the Islamic Rite, rather like the Christian Rite. And this is a useful idea. Okay? You can think of it that way. It is kind of like the Christian Rite. You could call it the Islamic Rite. Although it's different, of course, because the Christian Rite is a movement in the world's only superpower. And the Islamic right is a power in global southern countries that are dealing with much more powerful and very intrusive Western countries. Or you could think of Islamists as one form and Christianists are another. What would that mean? It's another synonym with Islamic activism. What are they talking about? They want to bring all elements of social, economic, and political life into harmony with what they think is so-called true Islam. Now, as a non-Muslim, I have nothing to say, and if you're not a Muslim, neither should you, about what quote-unquote true Islam might mean. If you're a Muslim, of course, that's very much what you want to talk about with your fellow Muslims. But the idea for us here is that this notion of true Islam is highly contested. Different Muslims have very different ideas about what this means. And there is a huge debate going on among the 1.2 billion people who are Muslims in the world about what this might mean. Islamists have a very particular interpretation of it, and it is a social movement. The key to understanding this, in my judgment, is to think of Islamism as a social movement that, like any other social movement, particularly if it is large and diverse, has all kinds of different and analytical perspectives, and huge debates over strategy, huge debates over tactics, in a way that, if you're a student of European history, is very reminiscent of what happened in Europe in the social movement that was called socialism in 19th century Europe. There were all kinds of different folks. Folks ranging from anarchists who were throwing bombs at czars to folks who thought, really, like members of the Labour Party in England, you should go down and organize the miners in the mine and have trade unions and get better elections and have community services that were improved. And everything in between. Communists, democratic socialists, in socialism. Think the same way when you think about socialism. Now, both of these, Islamism or Christianism, are not different from modernity. They're responses to modernity. And we've seen this already. We saw this when we looked at the Christian right and the Stokes trial and all these kinds of phenomena that in the United States, it was the interaction of people with development of modernity that led to this. So there are parallels here. It's also a response to these social disruptions. It's a response to these problems. It's a response to the intrusions of outside actors. These are the problems that their slogan, Islam is the solution. These are the problems to which Islam is posited by them to be the solution. If you want to read a really interesting book that compares the rise of the Christian right and the rise of the Islamic right, there's a book called The Battle for God by Karen Armstrong, paperback, very interesting. So let's talk about the different kinds of Islamisms. We think, okay, first it's a social movement, and I'll say more about exactly what that means and why we care in a minute. But let's just get a typology. Well, the first typology, of course, it depends hugely, it matters a lot, whether or not the Muslims in question are adherents to the majority view in Islam, which are Sunni Islam, or the minority view thought of globally, but a majority in certain countries, called Shi'ism. Shia. These two different kinds of Islamists have very different tacks, different movements, and we'll talk about some of them in turn. And then within each of them, there are lots of different differences. Here's a map from the Atlas that's online. It's important for you to know where who is Sunni and who is Shia. Notice that the Shia, this map has some problems, the mislocation of Shia in Afghanistan, but never mind. What it shows is that if you look at the Persian Gulf, Iran is overwhelmingly Shia, southern Iraq is overwhelmingly Shia, and Shia are also found along the Gulf Coast of the Arab states. This map leaves out, because of this little thing here, the fact that there are large numbers of Shia in Yemen who are at the moment engaged in a kind of war against the government. So let's talk about the Shia first of all. The Imam Khomeini, whom we care about a lot, was the leader of the Iranian Revolution, was not a traditionalist. Okay? Again, if you think traditional, you will get lost immediately. This guy was an innovator. He was a revolutionary. He came up with an idea that nobody had had before. He called it governance by the jurisprudent. That is basically simplest way to think about this is it would be the basic equivalent of if in the United States Constitution the Supreme Court had a line item veto on every piece of legislation and every decision by the executive branch. It's basically that idea. Okay? And so this was what he did. Now, some people accept this, and some people don't. For example, the most powerful Ayatollah in Iraq, a man named Sistani, who basically ran circles around the Americans when we occupied the country and got the outcome that he wanted, not the outcome that the American government wanted. He doesn't accept this concept. Right? It was an innovation. He thinks about this differently. And then even if you do accept it, there are some political actors in Iraq who do, and there's a debate about, well, who is it? Who is this jurisprudent who should have this power? So, again, splits, differences, typical of social movements. You get these different views all over the place. You look at the Sunnis. There are different forms this takes. Missionary activity. And notice that name because we'll come back to this when we talk about Iraq. A da'wah, basically the call, a call summons to people to become better Muslims. And this is what goes on in lots of places. It also happens to be the name of the Shi'i Islamist political party that is headed by Nouri al-Maliki, who is the Prime Minister of Iraq. Okay? So Shi'i Islamists are in control of the government of Iraq. Certainly in the Arab regions, they do this in coalition with the Kurds. And this was not exactly what the Americans had in mind, but it was quite inevitable and obvious had they bothered to think about it, which they didn't. There's a restricted sense of forming political parties. There is a very powerful movement in Egypt called the Muslim Brotherhood. We'll talk about them. And there are a variety of other movements we need to talk about. And then last but not least, we have the crazies. We have the violent guys, the jihadis, and so on. Question?
You said that Ayatollah Khomeini came up with the idea of governance by the jurisprudence.
Yes.
Does that mean that he started Shia Islam?
No.
Okay.
No. What I'm saying is that no, Shia Islam started many, many hundreds of years ago. Basically, the dispute is, you should go read about it. We don't really have time to talk about it. Go get a basic book on Islam and find out what the difference is. It happened about, the dispute is about who is the legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Who should be the caliph. And the Sunnis basically thought the caliph should be selected by a form of community agreement. And the Shia thought, no, it should pass to the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and in particular, the fourth caliph, who was Ali, who was then killed in a fight with others. They think his descendants should be the successors, but we'll talk about this a little more as we go through this. No, what Khomeini did was come up with a specific idea of how a Muslim state, specifically a Shia state, should be governed, and this idea had never been seen before. This was brand new. So it's a social movement. But what is a social movement? The civil rights movement was a social movement. The environmental movement is a social movement. The Christian right is a social movement. And Islamism is also a social movement. A group challenge to established authority by people who share a common purpose and set of ideas. This is a very big tent in this region. It ranges from, let's just take the two extremes. Here are two extremes of Islamists. The one on the right, you know something about, because we Americans know about him. Osama bin Laden. He's violent and conspiratorial. He's self-appointed. His program is extremely vague. And he's, to put it mildly, murderously intolerant of anyone who disagrees with him. Who's this guy on the left? This is the current Prime Minister of Turkey, one of the United States' historically closest allies, a member of NATO, who was democratically elected, formerly had been mayor of Istanbul. He is the Prime Minister, and his program is to try to get Turkey to join the European Union. He promotes freedom of speech and assembly, yet he is also regarded as an Islamist. So these are the kind of two extremes. This is a very, very big tent. And it's a thoroughly modern phenomenon. It has its origins in opposition to colonialism in Egypt, in India first, but then spreading elsewhere. And then you remember from that discussion of the Arab Cold War that there was a struggle among all these lots of different ideologies. There's Islamism, but there was also Arab nationalism. There was Marxism of various kinds. They were all fighting each other and fighting each other while at the same time having lots of external impacts like the Cold War, and then after the Cold War, all of this happened. So again, we're trying to interweave international political developments with what goes on internally, because societies and ideas are no different from the state. They're Janus-based. They look internally and they look externally, and they do this at the same time, and that dynamic as it evolves over time is what we want to think about. Here's a photograph that I found that is really, if you know how to interpret it, very revealing of divisions among leaders with respect to Islam in the Muslim world in the mid-1980s. What we have here this is the Emir of Kuwait. This is the 1970s. This is King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. This is Muammar Gaddafi, the somewhat unusual leader of Libya. And this guy over here is Saddam Hussein. They're in a mosque where the way prayer works is men line up in rows on a carpet. And notice the difference in their dress and postures. These men are in a formal position for prayer. They look very traditionally dressed. This man, Muammar Gaddafi, is praying, going through the prayer, but he's dressed in a Western suit. This is this attempt to mix different kinds of things, trying to take the religion and also wear a suit, and trying to come up with some kind of a synthesis. And Saddam Hussein over here, well, he looks really bored, right? This is, in a way, a good way. Their ideologies were similar. Right? That is, their postures and dress reflect their ideology. Saddam paid lip service to Islam. He's ruling a Muslim country. He had to do that. But he obviously did not care. He drank, he smoked, he did all kinds of things, and he certainly persecuted Islamists with great ferocity. Those weren't the only people he persecuted, but he certainly did this. Gaddafi persecuted anyone who didn't agree with him, but also had as the core of his peculiar ideology a form of Islamism. And these folks over here, this man in particular, had a great deal to do with the power of Islamism in the world in the last generation. If it's a social movement, then it's got to have social basis of support. That is, what's the coalition? Because it's usually diverse. Right? You think about the environmental movement, right? The environmental movement, the people who participate in this are quite different. You get young people who are very concerned about agriculture, for example. You get corporate executives who want to save money on electricity bills, and all kinds of other people. It's a diverse coalition. All social movements are like that. What's the coalition of this movement? First, it is a counter-elite of business and professional people. Okay? These guys, especially the leadership, are typically very well educated and often have a wide range of skills. They're counter to those who are close to the state. Okay? There are splits between these kinds of business folks and other business folks, or these kinds of professionals and other professionals. There are typically business people who are outside of the state-owned and controlled enterprises. Notice immediately, if you're a Westerner and you want to go in and say, well, let's promote private enterprise, what will happen? You will tend to strengthen the hands of business folks who may think your foreign policy is absolutely anathema. And we'll see, in the case of Turkey, this is exactly how Recep Erdogan got into power, was through the power, among other things, of business people outside the state-controlled and owned enterprises. Then there are intellectuals who are frustrated. Intellectuals are typically frustrated because people don't listen to you. But this is more of a problem there, and we have a mass base. One of the reasons we were so interested in the youth bulge is that this provides some of the basis of support, and increasingly the urban poor in the slums are also a source of support. Now, The specific configurations of this coalition will vary from country to country and over time. Both in space and time, this coalition will vary, but it's a useful kind of taxonomy of thinking about it. Now, why do people listen to these folks? How come? Well, we know some of these answers already. We know that youth are deeply frustrated. They can't get jobs, housing is terrible, but they also can see that states have failed to cope. The old ideology of Arab nationalism, first there was Nasser, and he got smashed in 1967. Then there were various other folks, like in Syria, like in Iraq, like the Ba'ath Party, and Saddam Hussein, to put it mildly, was a difficult guy to really give allegiance to. And anyway, he's been overthrown and destroyed. So if you're going to be in opposition, that ideology doesn't look so good. Well, what about the ideology of Marxism? Well, that doesn't look so good either, now does it, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So what's left? Well, what's left is Islamism. And these states have a variety of political failures. They're deeply corrupt. They're profoundly repressive and violent. It's not difficult to see injustice all over the place. And, last but hardly least, they can't even defend the nation state against external pressures. This leads to a sense of humiliation. And we've already seen how important humiliation is as a political driver of political psychology when we looked at nationalism. And it's no less true today. Shibli Tilhami, professor at the University of Maryland, an Egyptian by origin, American citizen, has this to say, which in many ways sums it up. The source of militancy is not because of military prospects or states, but because of this pervasive sense of humiliation and helplessness. When people are humiliated and helpless, you will get political entrepreneurs to appeal to them. If you want to understand the Tea Party movement in the United States, we should begin by thinking about humiliation and helplessness that many ordinary Americans out there in the heartland feel. That's where this comes from. Well, now, is the response something that we think is sensible? I certainly don't. But the same can be true of Islamists. Nevertheless, when you get helplessness and humiliation of this kind, you are likely to get political responses. Islamism is a call for justice. They denounce inequalities up to a point. They're not redistributionists on a huge scale along the lines of socialists, but they attack the conspicuous consumption of elites, for example. They call for some measure of social equality better than what they've got now. Their key concept, if you think, what was the key concept for Marxian socialists? Well, it was this class model of the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the workers. And the workers were the proletariat. That was, their idea was their location in the system of production. In the case of Islamists, it's really much more interesting. It's more the location of the poor in the sense of consumption. They're called the mustadafin, the deprived. Those who things are taken away from. The word comes, its root in Arabic is the word for weak. And so the idea is the protection of the weak is the basic idea here. They can point, Islamists can point to strong religious roots for such calls and appeals. Islam has been from the beginning a very socially oriented religion. Social solidarity is a major value in Islam, whatever the variety of it may be, and you see this over and over again. So they can point to this. And one thing they call for is nizam. They call for order. I don't know how many times I remember being somewhere in Cairo and something would go wrong, something that the government was running would fall apart, or something really awful would happen, and the response of the people standing next to me would be, Mafish nizam, there's no order here. There's no order. This is just a mess. We live in a giant mess. And so that sentiment is appealed to by Islamists who say, look, folks, we have a program for establishing social order. We have a program for including everybody in the society, and last but not least, we have a program to reassert our own national and cultural dignity in the world. So here's a summary slide that shows how I think about Islamism. It's a social movement fed by three streams. The youth bulge in its challenges, the state's failures, and not only socioeconomic, but in legitimacy that has given rise to this. So that's kind of doing the X-ray approach, right? Looking at the analytical elements. Now let's look at it in the movie version. Let's look at the role of it over time. How did this develop? And what additional insights can we get by looking at how it developed over time? Well, I don't have time to do this in detail, but let's just sketch it. First, immediate post-colonial failures. We've seen some of these already. You've got import substituting industrialization and nationalism, which had some achievements to its credit, but ran into many problems. We have the youth bulge, sluggish job creation, and last, especially in the Arab world, but elsewhere in the Muslim world as well, the ongoing sore of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the failure of anyone to resolve the problem of the dispossession of the Palestinians. Then comes the oil boom. What does the oil boom do? Well, it greatly strengthens a system of Islamic finance. That is, a banking system that is outside of the normal Western channels, that's run by somewhat different rules, although there's a big debate about just how different it is, and which was also a source of many of these businessmen who were outside of the state in one way or another. Then you get liberalization. You get the West coming in and some locals saying, look, ISI has been a failure, so we need to liberalize, we need to privatize. And then you get the phenomenon that was called crony capitalism. This is really what happened in Russia. If you start selling off the state assets, well, how do you do this? Does everybody get a fair shot at getting to own this? Well, probably what happens is the folks that are already close to the government get first dibs on this. In other words, it's corrupt. These benefits are passed out through a rather corrupt process that does little to enhance the legitimacy. And so this, combined with strategies against the political left that encouraged the Islamic right. Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, who was shot by an Islamist and killed, had himself encouraged them as a counterweight to Egyptian Marxists. And we'll see this a number of times. The Islamic right was fostered through the Cold War by the United States, by Israel, and by governments that were friendly to the United States. And we had this phenomenon of labor migration, and I mentioned this before, this Egyptian colloquial term, Gulfea, which means Gulfization. People came from poor society, they came from more tolerant and relaxed societies. And then they went to these highly conservative places like Saudi Arabia. But, money talks everywhere. And they see, well, we may be more relaxed and tolerant back in Sudan, in southern Egypt, or wherever it may be. We go to this place and they're rigid and uptight, but boy, do they have money. They've got a lot of it. And maybe there's something to this. Now, never mind that their money comes from oil rents. Okay? But never mind. People's perception was what mattered. To many of them, despite lots of labor abuses, this was a pretty powerful argument. They said, well, this is good. Okay? We like these people. Look at all this money. I like that. I'd like to be more like them. And you got this kind of phenomenon that started seeping into the cultures of lots of these countries. Third thing. The collapse of oil prices in 1986 and that period from 86 to roughly 2000 of low oil prices. What happens? Well, governments didn't have a lot of money in many cases, and they had to make choices. And the World Bank was pushing them to do this, to privatize things. What they did was as sociologists put it, there was an evacuation of social spaces. They did less for education. They did less to provide transportation. They did less to provide health care, creating opportunities for privately organized and privately funded political entrepreneurs to start supplying those services, which is what happened. Meanwhile, people are being hammered by falling incomes, and you get this liberalization, which further weakens legitimacy. Right? Fourth piece, globalization. As the world integrates more and more, as more and more people can travel, as the cost of travel falls, as the internet is created, as there are all kinds of communications, you get lots of migration, lots of people sharing ideas, and this, clearly, doesn't really fit very well with old-fashioned nationalism. Because everybody's traveling around and everybody's sharing ideas. Now, there are lots of alternative, more globalized ideologies we could imagine. Liberalism, like small L liberalism would be one. There are lots of possibilities, but one possibility was definitely Islamism, which is a self-proclaimed non-nationalist, even in some cases anti-nationalist, kind of phenomenon. It basically says, look, the basis of allegiance should not be ethnic nationalism. It should be religion. It should be whether or not you adhere to these tenets of religion. Of course, how those are interpreted depends on who you're talking to. But that then fit better into a globalized world. And, critically, the Cold War. We perceived Islamists as allies throughout the Cold War. This was also true of anti-Islamists in the Turkish military and of the Israeli security establishment in the 1970s. Supported the Islamists against the left, against the Soviets. The most extreme case that I will start lecturing about next week is Afghanistan, but it was not the only case. In effect, we in the United States would fund any fanatic provided only that he opposed the political left. So that's a kind of sketch of the way in which Islamism sort of emerged. Let's talk about how they act socially. What are their modes of social action? They basically do three things, and what the combination is, of course, varies, because this is a movement, and it has different factions, and it has different pieces, and situations change on the ground. Everything is dynamic and fluid. One thing they do, as we'll see, is they provide social welfare services. They move in to occupy those spaces evacuated by states under the pressure of liberalization, IMF dictates, or whatever. They also, depending on the local situation, participate in electoral politics. And last but not least, again, depending on the situation in which they find themselves, one, and two, depending on their specific ideology, they engage in what Marxists in the old days used to call armed struggle. And I use this Marxist phrase deliberately to kind of think about Islamism as a social movement, not all that different from the social movement of socialism in 19th and early 20th century Europe. Let's talk about the first one, provision of social services. Here's a case from Egypt. That's the symbol of the Muslim Brotherhood. As the state evacuated social spaces, and I experienced this firsthand when I lived there, what did the Islamists do? They had money. Where did they get this money? They got this money from private businessmen, and they got a lot of it from Saudi Arabia. We'll talk about that particular coalition in a minute. But they had money, private money. And so they set up daycare centers. They set up clinics. They set up entire hospitals. They funded schools. If you think classes are crowded in here, you should see Cairo University. People are just hanging off the walls. They don't have webcasts. At least they didn't when I was there. And so lecture notes are critical. And so you had to buy lecture notes. And so these Islamists would develop lecture notes, and then they would pass them out for a very nominal fee. Textbooks, same thing. And then they would provide minibus transport services for women who conformed to their dress code. Many women liked this because then they were not subject to various closet and not so closet assaults on the bus system, which was less true in public buses. And they set up study groups. So you can see what they did. The state has less ability to do any of these things, partly because of the youth bulge, and partly because they have less money. People still want them, so they get supplied by somebody else. And who's that somebody else? The Muslim Brotherhood and their friends. How about something called the Islamic Resistance Movement in Palestine, whose acronym is Hamas? What did they do? They did the same thing. They set up religious schools and kindergartens. They set up, and to this day, fund libraries, sports clubs. They built mosques all over the West Bank and Gaza. By the year 2000, 250,000 people were getting supplements. This was necessary because these people lived right on the edge. 2/3 of the primary schools and kindergartens in Gaza were built by Hamas. Unsurprisingly, people tend to like them in Gaza. Take another movement. Hezbollah, the Party of God. I'll say more about them in a minute. In Lebanon, this is a Shia Islamist movement. Now, where did they come from? Well, after all, the Lebanese had a civil war that lasted, say, 14, 15 years, kind of tapered off and ended finally. And during the period of that civil war, there was effectively no government at all in Lebanon, so no state. Meanwhile, what they did, they fought in the war, and then they started massive construction projects. 10,000 of them. 45% of the drinking water in the southern, largely Shia slums of southern Beirut, which I visited, are provided by Hezbollah and its political allies. They've set up power generation facilities. 40,000 people are treated in their clinics and hospitals, and they offer millions of dollars in scholarships. So again, these people move in and provide all of these kinds of services. So social services is one component of their mode of social action. Second mode of action is in electoral politics. Now, of course, you can only participate in electoral politics if there are elections, clearly. And if there are elections, there are different possible ways that elections can be conducted. First possibilities. You could have an Islamist group contest and win an election, but then, even though they won, be denied the power to govern. This was true in spades in Algeria, big time, and it was also true with Hamas in the Palestinian elections. Or you could have elections that are held, but they're rigged. So the Islamists participate in the election, but the elections are rigged, so they lose and they can't do anything. You could have relatively fair elections in which the Islamists participate. They don't win. But even though we're a minority, it could be you have a parliamentary system in which they join the ruling coalition, which is exactly what Hezbollah, or the Party of God, did and still does in Lebanon. Last case of which there is only one example, Turkey. You could have an election, the Islamists could win, and then they could govern. And that's exactly what's been going on in Turkey. Now let's talk about the last mode, so-called armed struggle. Well, one way to think about this, again, as I say, two things to think about. One is the conditions in which why do young men and women choose the path of violence to get political change, as opposed to sticking with some nonviolent form. Well, that's a very complex question, and the answer varies from one place to another. But elections might be denied, and this could then push you into violence. This is certainly a possibility. It could be that, foreign occupations do not do much for you. This is the case, certainly, for the Palestinians. It's the case, as the Lebanese perceive it, in southern Lebanon. It was the case in Iraq. And in many areas of Afghanistan is perceived similarly. But there's another component here, which again is helpful to think back to the movement, the other social movement called socialism. In socialism, in Marxism, in particular among Marxists, there was for a period at different times a political and ideological tendency that was called voluntarism. Che Guevara is perhaps the primary example of this among Marxists, but there were many others. The basic idea was you just go out and create some acts of violence, you attack the government, and then people will rise up to support you. It was kind of like, this is an old idea. John Brown, when he attacked Harper's Ferry on the eve of the Civil War, had exactly the same idea. He thought, in his deluded way, that if he attacked the U.S. government arsenal in Northern Virginia, that there would be a giant slave revolt all over the South. Well, it didn't work out quite like that. But this notion of all it takes is some violent action and then the masses will rise up. This is embodied in the ideas of a group called Islamic Jihad and its successors Al-Qaeda, which is Osama bin Laden fame. Let's talk a little bit about the origins of this violent tendency. There is a long school of thought here. It goes back all the way to the 13th century in the wake of the Mongol invasion and devastation of Iran, and particularly in Iraq. When Baghdad was sacked, it was said by chroniclers that the rivers ran with blood from all the people who were killed. There was a guy named Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a Syrian, who began to rail against anyone who cooperated with the Mongols, and we'll talk more about him in a little bit. Then you get resistance to colonialism. Colonialism was itself an inherently violent movement. After all, how do you colonize people? Well, never fear, for we have got the Maxine gun, which they have not. And so colonialists come in with superior force, but it's resisted violently. You get it, though, for our purposes, more recently, in Egypt. Hardly anybody talks about this. The origins of Al-Qaeda, sure, they're in Saudi Arabia, and yes, they're in Afghanistan, but they're also very much in Egypt. And what happened was a split inside the Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest, the most established political movement of political Islam in the country. There was a particular man named Sayyid Qutb who was executed by Nasser in 1966, and there became an increasingly violent tendency in Egypt. They assassinated Sadat. They launched a kind of attempt of armed rebellion in southern Egypt. The Egyptian state crushed this with considerable violence. They fled first to Sudan and then to Afghanistan, and we know some of the rest of the story. Here's Sayyid Qutb in an Egyptian prison awaiting execution. Who was this guy? Well, he was an Egyptian school teacher. He visited Colorado in 1949, was scandalized by our mores, didn't like them much. And he was one of the people developing this ideology of takfir. Takfir is an Arabic word. It comes from kafir, which is a word for infidel. But it's the pronunciation of infidelity. It's an active verb. And its importance is that we now sometimes speak of a whole ideology of takfiris. These are people who are Muslims and basically say, any Muslim who doesn't agree with me isn't a Muslim. And therefore, it's okay for me to attack them and go after them. Okay? This is the ideology of takfir, and we're going to talk about this. Nothing about violence in the Middle East can be understood without some grasp on this ideology. He was executed. Here's a useful, again, analogy with Marxism. The takfiris are the Khmer Rouge of Islamism. Okay? There were lots of different kinds of Marxists. Only one group of them, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, were so crazy that they tried to empty all the cities and basically kill anybody with any education. If you wore eyeglasses, you were dead meat, because that meant you probably read books, and that was bad, that was bourgeois. I mean, really out there craziness. Well, this takfiri to many Muslims is equivalent. It's this pronunciation of unbelief on perfectly good Muslims, and they always say, well, what are you talking about? Man, who are you to tell me this? But nevertheless, this is the ideological tendency. There's an obsession with ideological purity. Just as an aside, whenever you see people talking about ideological purity or political purity, look for the nearest door, check the exits, and run. Okay? They're really dangerous. It's always a mess. Don't go there. Okay? They're obsessed with women's status in a way that many other Islamists are not. And many Muslims think that they're just plain weird. You know, like, what's wrong with flying kites? I mean, what's this about? Okay? Why is it necessary to brush your teeth in the same way as the Prophet Muhammad? Who really cares? Does that matter so much? Right? They also, importantly, typically deny that Shia Muslims are Muslims. And this is a long strain in takfiri behavior. We'll see it in the origins of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It goes way back. It's important. It matters. And then they label Sunnis who don't agree with them as infidels. They're conspiratorial. They're violent. And they're intolerant. They also, so far as I can figure out, and I've tried to figure it out, they don't seem to have much of a coherent program. If you ask them, okay, so, all right, you're going to take over the government of, I don't know, let's say Egypt. And how are you going to run this place? I mean, how are you going to generate foreign exchange, for example? How are you going to create jobs? Vague statements. They typically don't answer. You don't get answers. Right? So you don't get these kinds of things. Question?
So what are they obsessed about with that? Like, what kind of?
Specifically notions, well, for example, they think that women should be fully veiled. They think they should cover their bodies. They think they should not wear, quote-unquote, revealing clothing. They, in some cases, the more extreme version, like the Taliban, believe that women should not work outside of the home. They believe, like sometimes the Taliban, they should not get education. By no means all Islamists think this. Okay? And even, it is not even true that all takfiris believe this, but you get ranges of that sort. Okay. Now, A phrase in the jihadi literature is this: there's the near enemy and there's the far enemy. The near enemy were the states that they were trying to overthrow. The far enemy supported the near enemy. They initially tried to attack this state. They attacked the state of Egypt. They attacked the state of Algeria. They attacked various local states whom they regarded as corrupt, that they called them infidels, even though all of them were Muslims. And they failed. They were crushed. They were defeated. Their analysis then was, the reason we lost is that this near enemy has so much support from the far enemy, the United States, that therefore we have to attack the far enemy. This is the origin of 9/11. This is where it came from. Is the notion among the Takfiri group called Al-Qaeda that attacking the states of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, of Algeria, this was a failure, it wasn't working out, they're supported too much by the Americans, we got to go after the Americans. This was the idea. We had of course helped them to emerge, talk about this next week, in Afghanistan. Saudis, Pakistanis, and Americans all helped them. Bin Laden got his start in the Afghan war against the Soviets when the United States went in, put bases in Saudi Arabia, attempting to attack Saddam and successfully attacking Saddam in the war about Kuwait. He was scandalized by this, turned in opposition to the Saudi government. He fled to Sudan. We kicked him out of Sudan. He went back to Afghanistan. And nobody knows whether he's still alive or not. If he is, he's almost surely in Pakistan. Now, this phenomenon, again, it's important to step back and adopt a historical perspective on this phenomenon of large numbers, not by no means the majority even of the Islamists, but significant numbers of often very well-educated young people or other people just suddenly going for really strange, very violent political ideologies. There's a famous late historian named Norman Cohn who wrote a book called The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is about movements of crazed peasants in medieval Europe. And this is what he had to say. Certain segments of the poor were captured by some millenarian prophet. Fantasies of a world reborn into innocence through a final apocalyptic massacre. This describes the Khmer Rouge in spades. It describes as well a lot of the violent jihadists grouped loosely around Al-Qaeda. But typically, notice, even in the Middle Ages, poor and oppressed whose traditional life has broken down and who have lost faith in traditional values, they try to reassert it. Again, the Great Transformation, nothing is as disruptive of the traditional way of life as the Great Transformation. So let's look at an example of these violent jihadis. The Algerian Civil War, something Americans know very little about, but raged throughout the 1990s. How did this happen? Remember, highly capital-intensive state-owned economy driven by oil bills. Suddenly, the money goes away. There's a huge depression. The state is deeply corrupt. In fact, Algerians even had a French term for those who ran the state, le pouvoir, which is French for simply the power. The power. They had all of it, and they misused it extensively. Islamists sprang up in opposition to them. There was a thing called the Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS. There were riots in 1988, and then the regime tried liberalization and held some elections. Who was this social movement? There were two leaders. There was an older guy, a relative moderate. Then there was a younger firebrand. And they made a very strong appeal to the poor and to the urban youth. That whole phenomenon of planet of slums, Algeria of slums with a youth bulge. They were Salafists. That is, there is a strain in Islam that says that everyone should go back and try as closely as possible to emulate in every detail, and I mean every detail, including how you brush your teeth, the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate companions as closely as we can figure out what that was. Their relationship to democracy was rather ambiguous. This is what happened in the election. They swept the election. Just by the way, this is the Sahara Desert out here. Hardly anybody lives out here. Nearly everyone in Algeria lives in here, in this chunk in the north, because that's where the rainfall is. So it was an overwhelming victory for the peace. But the government canceled the next round of elections, and the fighting started. It was called, to this day, La Guerre Sale, the Dirty War. It was marked by atrocities and human rights abuses on a horrifying scale on both sides. It was really, really brutal. As the war went on, what often happens in wars of this kind is that each side becomes more and more extreme. The thugs in control of le pouvoir become more and more violent. Torture becomes more and more elaborate, more and more refined, more and more open. And the same thing happened on the radical side. Massacres of innocent villagers, all kinds of stuff took place. The government finally defeated them. And the government had a lot of help from the government of France in doing so, not to mention the United States. Finally, like so many of these civil wars, it finally burned itself out. But many of the young men who fought here are now in Al-Qaeda. There's a strong Algerian component in Al-Qaeda, and there has long been. Again, remember, everything is connected. There is nothing new under the sun except for the history that we don't know. Nobody knows how many are killed. Responsible estimates are somewhere in this range. It was a bloody mess. Another example, much less violent example, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This was at its origins in the early 20th century, in resistance to British colonialism, including cultural resistance. They were defeated and persecuted by Nasser, by the Arab nationalists. So note, from the beginning, Arab nationalism and Islamism are in competition and often violent opposition inside that part of the world. Many of them, when they were defeated and persecuted by Nasser, left. And where did they go? Many of them went to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where they were welcomed. Close links were forged, if this was necessary, they were already there, between Islamists from Egypt and elsewhere in the world and the Saudis. You can see how that matters if then the Saudis get a huge amount of money. You think this might have political consequences? Oh, yes. In 1970, the Muslim Brotherhood, the mainstream, made a decision to give up violence. And they said this explicitly. They have continued to adhere to this. They have not done this. Instead, they focused on Islamizing society, on having these sort of on the daycares, the schools, the lecture notes, the taxis, the hospitals, all that kind of approach. But some young men didn't agree with this, and some young women also, and they split off and became violent militants. Among them, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is an Egyptian doctor who is the second in command of Al-Qaeda. He is to this day at large, but he's an Egyptian. Yes, Osama is a Saudi, but Ayman al-Zawahiri is an Egyptian, and that's where he came from. That's Hassan al-Banna. He's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Here they are being tried after they attempted to kill Nasser. Trying to kill Arab leaders will typically not be very good for your health. And so they were Nasser supporters, burned the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters, but the Muslim Brotherhood has not gone away in Egypt. Here they are, confronting the police in Cairo a few years ago, or students at Cairo University demonstrating in support of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are a real force. They abandoned violence to concentrate on this kind of work. They helped, along with the Israeli Internal Intelligence Service called Shin Bet, to establish a thing called the Islamic Resistance Movement, Harakat al-Muqawwimah al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Resistance Movement in Palestine, known to us as Hamas. Note this, Hamas was partly created by Israeli security. Why? Because they wanted a counterweight to Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat. And but be careful what you wish for is always the watchword in politics. So radicals split off, as I've mentioned. They turned on the Egyptian state, they were crushed, and they went to Afghanistan and elsewhere. Now, let's talk about the Shia and the Shia revival. Because nothing can be understood without grasping this. The most recent big war in the Middle East was in 2006, when for the first time in history, the Israeli Defense Forces essentially failed to achieve their military goals when they attacked Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Where does this organization come from? How can we understand this? They actually goes back to Lebanon, but actually to an Iranian preacher who goes to Lebanon. This is just a sketch. All of these forces matter, and I'll go through them in a bit. Let's talk about this guy. He's born in Iran. One thing, please note. Shia Muslims have intermarried with each other throughout history, and they have exchanged religious scholars, and they have gone to each other's countries to study. Okay? So it is just to note, for example, I mentioned this man, the Ayatollah Sistani. He's the most powerful Ayatollah in Iraq. He speaks Arabic with a strong Farsi accent because he's a Persian, as his name suggests. Sistani. Sistan is a region of Iran. There is nothing unusual about this. This has been going on always. People are going back and forth and back and forth. So this guy was in Iran, but he came to be a religious leader in the city of Tyre on the Mediterranean coast of Lebanon. He did the usual thing, setting up social services, schools. He founded this movement of the deprived. He established a group called Amal, which means hope in Arabic, and became part of the Shia resistance movement during the Lebanese Civil War. He mysteriously disappeared and is widely believed to have been murdered by Muammar Gaddafi, who does not like Shia militants. So he sets up this group called Amal that is fighting in the Lebanese Civil War. How do you get from Amal, of whom we hear very little these days, to Hezbollah, that we hear quite a lot about? Amal fought with the Palestinians led by Yasser Arafat in the first phase of the Civil War of Lebanon. The PLO, by all accounts, their fighters behaved arrogantly, violently, and corruptly throughout southern Lebanon, which is largely populated by Shia Muslims. Most of the PLO militants were Sunnis, and this did little to make them popular. In 1982, the Israeli state decided to invade Lebanon and did so, and moved in all the way to the gates of Beirut. Initially, when the Israelis came into southern Lebanon, the Shia thought, well, these guys maybe aren't so bad. I mean, they got rid of the PLO after all, but you know the way it is with occupiers. As Robespierre once said, nobody loves armed missionaries. And as the Israelis stayed, this quickly dismayed the locals, and then conjuncture of the Iranian Revolution and support the formation of the Party of God called Hezbollah. As usual, graphics can tell you a lot. This is the flag of Hezbollah, Party of God. If you know anything about Cuban revolutionary art posters, you will see some similarities. In particular, this iconic fist clutching a Kalashnikov rifle. Right? You see this on all kinds of global southern, the National Liberation Front in Vietnam used something like this. Certainly the Cubans have used it. And what it's attached to is the Arabic letters for the Party of God. And it just says down here, the Islamic resistance movement in Lebanon. And up here there's a Quranic quote that says, translated says, truly the Party of God, they are the conquerors. So this is this kind of, again, it's an ideology that is modernist. It draws, just as nationalism did, on traditions, on religion, but then it takes these and uses them and reconstructs them in a political way. They engage in armed struggle. Here they are. They helped finally, the Israeli government decided that the casualties they were sustaining in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah were not worth it. It wasn't worth the price. And so they withdrew. And they demonstrate a lot. And in 2008, there were rival demonstrations, and here they are demonstrating. The thing you notice is they're all wearing the same color T-shirt. These folks are organized, very, very organized. Now, we Westerners tend to think, okay, Islamists, right. So we think, yeah, they're all the same. And I've been saying in here, this is a fundamental error. We think, for example, they're very concerned about how women dress, and they're very interested in very conservative dress. And so obviously anybody who supports these, who is a woman, will be fully veiled. Well, oops, actually not. Not so much, you know. I mean, there it is. Pictures worth 1,000 words. Summarizing once again, beware of simple conclusions. In this part of the world, everything is a lot more complicated than you think. Now, there are some prominent, to put it mildly, Islamists in the country of Iraq. This guy. Right? He was the leader. The Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. This is an organization. This was its name. It was founded in Tehran during the Iran-Iraq War. Its leadership spent the entire Iran-Iraq War in Tehran, in Iran, very closely associated with the Iranian government. And in our wisdom, these are the folks that the American government decided to back in Iraq when we invaded. Sound a little strange to you? I hope it does. The next man is the current Prime Minister of Iraq. He was the head of a Da'wah party, which was the first Islamist movement in Iraq, which again has extremely close ties with the Iranians. And then last but not least, this movement of the urban poor in Baghdad, led by this young man. We'll talk more about him when we talk about Iraq. So here are Islamists, explicit Shia Islamists, allies of Hezbollah, right? Allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but, you know, we have Kudus shaking hands with the leader of the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. And there you have it. Another example, Islamism in Turkey. How did this happen? Ataturk was a relentless secularist. He loathed the Muslim clergy. He abolished the caliphate in 1924, something for which Islamists have never forgiven him. He imposed Western dress, outlawing, for example, the fez, which, ironically, had only been introduced in Turkey in the 19th century. His rule was based on segments of the old Ottoman elite, particularly the officer corps of the army. He had this party called the People's Republican Party in Turkish. It remains a staunch supporter of these cultural politics. Here is Ataturk doing something very scandalous to conservative Muslims, dancing with his wife in public. But there were contradictions in the Turkish political economy that allowed for the rise of the Islamists. We saw, in looking at the process of industrialization in Turkey, that in fact one of the reasons the state took such a strong role was the absence of an indigenous, ethnically Turkish bourgeoisie. So the state, in effect, set about creating such a bourgeoisie, and you know what? It worked. They were successful. They did this. Right? But as they did this, many of them tended to be found in smaller cities and towns in Anatolia, in the interior of the country, who people were culturally were much more conservative than the Republican elites around Ataturk. Turkish farmers, farm people, were also much more conservative. And so you get this contradiction. There's this state-sanctioned elitist secularism with, on the one hand, fostering the rise of people who don't agree with your cultural policies through your economic policies. And once you institute democracy, which first begins in 1950, you're enfranchising Turkish farmers, who are a large percentage of the population, and they also have rather conservative views. So what happens? You launch a struggle that is still going on between Turkish secularists and Islamists. Secularists had various sources of support. I'll talk about what the deep state is in a minute. And Islamists, again, same thing. The rural folks, some intellectuals, and this rising private sector-oriented business. What's the deep state? The Turkish idea, very useful, I think, for Americans as well. It says the state isn't what you see in government buildings. The real state, the real power, the deep state, is a kind of informal collection of elements of the bureaucracy, the security forces, and in the Turkish case, the criminal world, all linked together. And this is what really sort of is the key power behind the throne, if you like, in the Turkish Republic. Some people think that the United States, in what we call it the national security state, has something very similar to a deep state. You can elect a president, but do the policies on the military change very much? Well, not so much, actually. Could this be? Because there is such a thing as a deep state even in the United States. So learning needs to go in both directions in terms of learning from the Middle East, as well as perhaps some folks in the Middle East learning something from us. There's this dialectic. It goes back and forth. Developments in the economy and the polity are moving the country towards greater liberalization, those dynamics we talked about last time. But that also means less power for the deep state. The deep state launched coups. There were military coups in Turkey in these years. And in 1996, there was actually, they didn't actually do it, but they basically said, if the prime minister doesn't resign, we'll do a coup. And so he resigned. And there have been recent threats. They haven't been carried out. And the problem that the deep state has is that, yes, they can smash things. In effect, they echo Boris Yeltsin. You can make a throne of bayonets, but you cannot sit on it. You can throw people out of office, but then it's very difficult to actually govern the place. It's too complicated, so they have to cede power. And this has gone through some cycles. First election. This man, Adnan Menderes, won 3 elections. He campaigned in 1950 to allow the call to prayer to be said in Arabic, which is the traditional way to do it. Anathema to the deep state. He implemented more liberal economic policies. There was a coup. He was executed, shown being hanged here in the bottom slide. He was exonerated later. Okay? There were various trumped-up charges against him. Then there was a coup in 1980, a bigger coup. The oil price shocks hammered Turkey, which was an oil importer. There was rampant inflation. There was fighting in the streets between leftists and Islamists, as well as lots of criminal gangs. Political gridlock, electoral system that was almost as dysfunctional as the electoral system in the state of California, and all kinds of violence going on, and there was a coup. And once again, ironies abound. After the coup, a man named Turgut Özal, who had been trained as an engineer, worked in the United States for the Tennessee Valley Authority, then worked at the World Bank, loved America, devoted private sector kind of guy. From an IMF and World Bank point of view, Turgut Özal was the greatest thing since sliced bread. But he was also from the interior of Anatolia. He had somewhat more conservative views about this. He wasn't, it's unfair probably to say he was an Islamist, but nevertheless, the policies implemented strengthened this smaller bourgeoisie in Anatolia who happened to be pro-moderate Islamist. There's another guy, this is the man, Necmettin Erbakan. He's the guy who had to resign in 1996. So there's waves. It goes, and the Islamists kind of are gaining power, but they can't ever win an election and keep power. For that to happen, something else had to happen. In the late 1990s, Turkey made the big mistake of listening to the advice of the IMF, and they liberalized the capital account. What does this mean? It means that money could come into Turkey and go out of Turkey. It's easy to get money. This is the same thing that happened in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, the Asian financial crisis. The idea is the money comes in because prices are going up, but if all of a sudden all the money can then just go out at the touch of a computer button, this is highly destabilizing. These days, most economists think that weaker economies are probably ill-advised to have complete liberalization of the capital account. But it was very popular at the time. Turkey did it. When there was the run on the bank in the Asian countries, the same thing happened in Turkey, and the economy collapsed, the financial system collapsed. There was widespread political disgust, and there was a very popular mayor of Istanbul, a big city, one of the 2 biggest cities, and he said he formed a new party. He wins decisively. His platform is push liberalization of the economy, yes, enter the European Union, and push human rights. Why? Many reasons. One, he probably believes in it. But also, a policy of human rights for Islamists in Turkey undermines the power of the deep state, who are the main people who go after them, who have been arresting them and their fathers and torturing them and hanging them and doing all those kinds of things. So to say, look, if we enter the European Union, all the European rules about political dissent will apply, and those guys can't do that to us anymore. They see everything's complicated. Simple notions, Islamists are opposed to human rights, but all depends. Of course the Taliban are, but the Taliban are hardly the AKP party in Turkey. So in short, this struggle goes on. In this region, the region is huge. The problems are huge. Islamism is a vast and diverse movement responding to these domestic and foreign humiliations. And I think you can see by now, given just a kind of a taste, a little smorgasbord of the complexities of this in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Palestine, outsiders, if they intervene, almost always make things worse. This is kind of what we're about here. Right? And we go in and shoot our own shadow. Now, in a final irony here, you could argue that there has long been an Islamist state in the Middle East. That it's not new, and the longest-lived Islamist state in the Middle East is not the Islamic Republic of Iran. That the oldest, most established, and in many ways still very highly influential Islamist state in the Middle East is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we need to talk about this, because this is something of an irony now, isn't it? Okay? Here we have the old saying, once again, the world, my friends, is weird. This country, we already know, is a key player, arguably the key player, in the global oil market. It rests on a political coalition, and it has rested since its founding on a political coalition of, let me be blunt, takfiri ideologists, extreme, sort of hardline, obscurantist Islamic thinkers, and fabulously wealthy princes. And it has also been a close ally of the United States, although it would be hard to find two countries whose expressed political ideologies are more radically different. And last irony, not the government, but the civil society, the society itself, helped to spawn the only force that has attacked the mainland United States since Pearl Harbor in 1941. Of course, I'm talking about Al-Qaeda and 9/11. So the world is weird. There are lots of things. We must understand Saudi Arabia to make sense out of the world. It's a big place. It's about a fifth the size of the United States with a much smaller population. Maybe 28 million total. And of those, a big chunk are non-Saudis. We know population growth continues to be robust. Total fertility rate of just under 4 today. Low infant mortality rates, they've done a good job there. And youth literacy is very high. Notice in this old CIA map that we've looked at before, that the darker the color, the larger the increase in population that is projected. Notice that in Saudi Arabia, it is projected to be the largest. For which read, country with a major youth bulge problem, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. What's the ruling coalition? It's actually very simple. First, they even have names. The ruling family, founded by this man, Abdulaziz bin Abdurrahman al Saud, otherwise known as Ibn Saud, the House of Saud, and the clergy, ulama in Arabic, followers of this Salafi, this sort of very, very conservative interpretation of Islam, named Muhammad Wahhab. This is called the House of Sheikh. So there's the House of Saud and the House of Sheikh. These two houses, viewed metaphorically, but not entirely metaphorically, they are the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, the dialectics of rule in this place are very curious. The House of Saud uses vast oil rents to buy protection. And so you're talking of maybe 20 million people. Not very many folks in the whole country. You get it from outsiders. Pakistani military officers have long been important in defending the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the Americans have done all kinds of things. Internally, they used patronage. And historically, in the terms of when the state was first created, they used marriage alliances. But what they also did was they ceded control of religion, education, and culture to these extremely conservative ulama, which put them in charge of educating the rising generation of young people in the kingdom. Sounds interesting. Sounds like a potential recipe for trouble. So you get, for a number of reasons, ideological proselytizing, both at home and abroad. This is not an incidental component of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is a fundamental structural and ideological feature of this state. And it is a state characterized by deep contradictions. Here's one. It's very corrupt, yet it is also equally puritanical. Typically, these things seem to be in contradiction. And this contradiction is noticed by young Saudis. There is xenophobia, exclusion of outsiders. You cannot, for example, go to Saudi Arabia on a tourist visa. Tourist visas to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia do not exist. They don't let in, quote-unquote, tourists. You can go as a Muslim pilgrim. You can go for business. You can go if you're working for a government that sends you there, that the Saudis say, but you can't go as just an ordinary citizen. They don't like outsiders roaming around, yet at the same time, they're entirely dependent on outsiders for their support, both financially in terms of oil rents and also in terms of military defense. We have a deeply conservative ideology and a deeply conservative state on the one hand, and yet at the same time, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes not so inadvertently, they have simultaneously promoted revolutionary, takfiri, extremist Islamist, armed struggle, violent jihadi types. Another kind of contradiction. As usual, in thinking about states like this, we need to know where they came from. We need to look at their origins and what was the process of the formation of the Saudi state to make sense of it. First key point. The Saudis, the family of Saud, came from a region in the center of the country, not along the Persian Gulf, not along the Red Sea coast where Mecca and Medina are, but in the middle, in a stony, arid desert area called the Najd. Because the Najd was isolated, it didn't border, it had no coast, and because the Najd didn't have any resources to speak of, nobody cared about the Najd. The Ottomans didn't care. The Iranian empires didn't care. Nobody cared. It was an isolated backwater. This is where the family of Saud came from. And nobody cared about it. The coasts were much more important. Both the coast of the Hejaz, because of Mecca and Medina, with the sophisticated trading bourgeoisie and merchant class, and the two most sacred cities in Islam. And that area was loosely controlled by the Ottomans, quite loosely. And the Arab revolt that Lawrence of Arabia frames came out of the Hejaz, and it was ruled by a family called the Hashemites. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was formed as the House of Saud, coming out of the Najd, coming out of this very isolated and backward region, conquered the Hejaz and took over the Persian Gulf Coast, where, by the way, on the coast, there's a region, a province of Saudi Arabia called Al-Hassa province, which is where the oil is, where the population is largely Shia. Right? So, and then we get these extremist Sunnis taking over. Needless to say, their relations with the Shia have not been good. And from the beginning, there were elements of this kind of takfiri behavior. Way back in 1744, right? There's a preacher, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. That's why they're called Wahhabis by people who don't like them. Made an alliance with this prince in Najd. He was a takfiri. For instance, their forces attacked and burned down the holy Shia city of Karbala in Iraq. This was an outrage to Iraq, to Shia everywhere, and it is remembered to this day. They seized Mecca and Medina. When they did this, they tore down tombs and gravestones of close companions and wives of the Prophet Muhammad, and they destroyed tombs of Shia imams. People at the time were horrified by this, and notice, all the way back to 1744, there is really bad blood between takfiri, between extremist Sunni militants and the Shia. There are difficulties that go on to this day, and they were, to put it mildly, played out once again during the American occupation of Iraq. Who was this guy, this preacher? He was influenced by this guy who was so embittered by the Mongol invasion called Ibn Taymiyyah. Everything, he was basically like an old-fashioned Puritan. One of these old-time religion revivalists who sort of say, everything that's happened since the founder, although who exactly knows what that means, was bad. So, luxurious living, influence of Islamic mystics called Sufis, got to get rid of that. Rationalism, bad idea. Visiting the tombs of saints, etc., etc., etc. The Shia, all bad. All have to go, tear everything down, get rid of them. He was puritanical and obscurantist, and a mosque in his honor is right here, near Riyadh. Okay? Right there, very fancy mosque, very nicely laid out, renovated, held up. This is how it expanded. Starts in the Naj, nobody cared. Ottomans over here, and they spread this way, attacking Shia, and they go in here and take over the Hijaz. Now, the Ottomans were having none of this. They launched a campaign. They burned the capital, and they took back the Hijaz. There's a statue of this man, Ibrahim Pasha, who was the son of an Albanian mercenary who ruled Egypt at the time. And they took it back. But as we will see starting next time, the House of Saud will be back. But notice this. There's an earlier period in which there's this coalition between the House of Saud and the House of Sheikh. They expand. They attack the Shia. They try to impose their puritanical vision of Islam on the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Outside power in that case, in the form of the Ottoman Empire, came in and did away with them. This won't happen when that same coalition starts to expand after World War I. And we'll take up with that next time.
لا